When it comes to British horror cinema in the 1970s, there are two names to know. The first is Hammer, master of gothic horror with a slight exploitation bent, in terms of the lurid blood and overt cheesecake, though not necessarily so much of the actual gore. And the other is Amicus, masters of the anthology film, a genre film that, in particular, has had considerable traction in horror. This week, we continue our house hunting through the realms of the macabre with one of those anthology films, Dr. Terror's House of Horrors. Though this film does not particularly have any haunted houses in it, and the frame story doesn't even take place in a house, but rather in a train car. Still, house is in the title, so anyway, let us begin. As with Amicus's later film, Tales of the Crypt, and as mentioned before, this is a horror anthology film. And this film also features Hammer veterans, not one, but two. Peter Cushing is present in the frame story as Dr. Shrek, or Dr. Terror, the presenter for each of the tales of this anthology. The framing narrative here is 5 men get on a train. Architect Jim Dawson, played by Neil McCullum. Family man Bill Rogers, played by Alan Freeman. Jazz musician Biff Bailey, played by Roy Castle. Art critic Franklin Marsh, played by our other Hammer veteran, Christopher Lee. And physician Dr. Bob Carroll, played by Donald Sutherland, fairly early in his career. They are joined by Shrek, who bills himself as a doctor of the paranormal and offers to do a tarot reading for each of the passengers. They are initially skeptical, but eventually each agrees, leading into the 5 stories. These are more conventional horror stories instead of the EC comic style semi-morality plays featured in some of the later films like Vault of Terror and Tales of the Crypt, where bad people do bad things and are punished in a horrific manner for their actions. The film narrative implies that each story ends in some form of death, though some stories have more open-ended endings than others. Because of the nature of the anthology film and each story being relatively short, I don't want to spoil too much in terms of how the stories end, because that is the kicker, after all. The anthology opens strong with the stories Werewolf and Creeping Vine. These are some of the more conventional horror stories, focusing on, well, a werewolf and a killer plant, respectively. The following two, Voodoo and Disembodied Hand, are more the realm of EC Comics. Voodoo has Biff learning the dangers of cultural appropriation, while Disembodied Hand has Franklin learning the price of being a dick. Disembodied Hand, of the stories thus far, is kind of the weakest of the stories in this collection. It does the stupid thing of throwing in a take that at critics by having the antagonist be a self-centered critic who is more involved with wit than appreciating their medium. This is not to say these sort of critics don't exist, as the fact of that Cinema Sins YouTube channel exists after all, but I will admit that taking pot shots at critics in a work of fiction is not a good look, as Lady in the Water and State of Fear will demonstrate, though I admit I am somewhat biased. The final story, Vampire, is decent enough, though the featured actor, Donald Sutherland, feels underutilized. I'll admit there is a certain degree of bias to this, considering I know how far Donald Sutherland goes in his career, and the very impressive performances he puts in some of his later work, including other horror films, like the remake/semi-sequel Invasion of the Body Snatchers in the 1970s. The material here works well enough, but Sutherland isn't given enough material to work with. I don't know if it's the case of where Sutherland is in his career, as again, he'd only been acting on screen for 3 years by this point, and his greatest roles are still ahead of him, or if it's the director, or just how much time they had to shoot his scenes in the film. The film is pretty decent. It's less consistent in its quality than another of Amicus's anthology films, Tales of the Crypt. As most of the stories here are new to the film, whereas Tales of the Crypt is adapting a variety of EC Comics stories from Vault of Horror and, of course, the title book. But still, what we get is worth watching, especially this October. Next time, on Halloween, we close out our house hunt of horrors with a journey from the UK to Japan, with a story that, for once, actually involves a haunted house, as we have one of perhaps the biggest cult films in Japanese horror, House. I'll see you then. If you dare. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the show, please like and subscribe. And also consider backing my Patreon. Patreon backers get episodes up to 1 week early of this show and any future Let's Plays. Also, please consider backing my Ko-fi. Toss me a few bucks also helps support the show, and it's not a monthly obligation or anything like that.